Have you ever wondered what family secrets might be buried beneath generations of whispers? What if the stories you were told as warnings weren't meant to scare you away from danger, but to keep you from discovering the truth? I'm about to share something with you that I've never told another living soul, a truth about my family that's been hidden for nearly a century. Welcome to the OBSCURALORE Vault. Today's story. The local legend about my great-grandmother being a witch was actually a cover story. What she really discovered beneath our family property isn't from this world. Part 1. I grew up in the shadow of Blackwood Ridge, a forgotten corner of the Appalachian Mountains, where cell service still cuts out more often than not, and folks keep to themselves. Our family home sits on 40 acres that's been in our name since before the Civil War, a fact my father repeated like a point of pride whenever anyone asked how we came to own such a large parcel of land. The house itself is nothing special. 2 stories of weathered clapboard with a wraparound porch, surrounded by ancient oaks and maples that block out the sun, even on the brightest summer days. But it's what lies beyond the house that always captured my attention as a child. A stone wall marking off about an acre of land behind the property, and inside that wall, nothing but bare earth. No grass, no weeds. Nothing grew there. "That's your great-grandmother's garden," my father would say when I asked about it. "Best leave it be." Of course, being told to leave something alone only made me more curious. When I asked the other kids at school, they'd exchange nervous glances before one of them would inevitably whisper, "That's where the witch worked her magic." The witch they referred to was my great-grandmother, Eliza Blackwood. I learned about Eliza in fragments, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered a room, strange looks from townsfolk when they heard my last name, and the occasional warning from my father to respect the boundaries she set. According to local legend, she was a practitioner of dark arts who could curse crops, commune with spirits, and predict deaths. Some even claimed she could transform into animals at night to spy on her neighbors. When I was 10, I finally worked up the courage to ask my grandmother, Eliza's daughter, if her mother had really been a witch. She looked at me with such fear in her eyes that it made my blood run cold. "Some things are better left buried, child," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll never go into that garden. Promise me." I promised, and for many years, I kept that promise. Part 2. It wasn't until my father's death last winter that I had reason to return to the family home. I hadn't been back in over a decade, having moved to the city for college and stayed there, building a life far away from the whispers and strange looks. But now, as the last living Blackwood, the property had passed to me. The lawyer handed me a sealed envelope along with the deed. "Your father left instructions that this was to be given to you upon his death," he explained, sliding the yellowed envelope across his desk. He was very specific about it. I opened it later that night in the dusty living room of my childhood home. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. "The time for secrets has passed. Look in the attic trunk with the red latch. Forgive us for what we've hidden." The attic had always been off-limits when I was growing up, another boundary I wasn't meant to cross, but now, with the house empty except for ghosts and memories, I found myself pulling down the folding stairs and climbing up into the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the sweet musty smell of old paper. Moonlight filtered through a small round window, illuminating stacks of boxes and forgotten furniture. And there, pushed against the far wall, was a large trunk with a rusted red latch. The key fit perfectly. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed with age. On top was another note, this one in handwriting I didn't recognize, more elegant, with swooping curves and sharp angles. To my descendants, if you are reading this, then the burden of knowledge has passed to you. Guard it well. The seal must not be broken. Eliza Blackwood. I stayed in the attic until dawn, reading Eliza's journals by flashlight. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family and the land we'd guarded for generations. Eliza Blackwood had not been a witch. She had been a guardian. Part 3. The journals began in 1921, when Eliza was just 22 years old. She had inherited the property from her father, who died suddenly of what the town doctor called acute melancholia, resulting in cardiac failure. Reading between the lines, I understood that he had taken his own life, though Eliza never stated it directly. What she did describe in painstaking detail was what happened 3 weeks after his funeral, when she noticed a strange depression forming in the ground behind the house. April 18th, 1921, the sinkhole appeared overnight, nearly 6 feet across and so deep I cannot see the bottom when I shine my lantern down. Father always warned me about the unstable ground behind the house, but this seems different. The edges are too perfect, too circular. It looks deliberate. Over the next few days, the hole grew larger. Eliza tried to fill it with rocks and soil, but by morning the hole would be empty again, as if something below was consuming whatever she put into it. April 21st, I awoke to sounds coming from the hole, not animal sounds, not human either. A rhythmic clicking, like fingernails on glass, but deeper, lower. When I approached with my lantern, the sounds stopped. But I feel watched now, even inside the house with doors locked and curtains drawn. On April 23rd, Eliza decided to explore the hole. She tied a rope to a nearby tree and lowered herself down, carrying only a lantern and her father's old service revolver. What she found was not a natural cave system or an abandoned mine shaft as she had expected. Instead, she discovered a perfectly circular chamber with walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And carved into those walls were symbols, thousands of them, spiraling from floor to ceiling in patterns that made her eyes hurt to follow. The symbols seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them, and there is a doorway on the far side of the chamber, an archway filled with absolute darkness. No light penetrates it. When I approach, I feel a cold so intense it burns my skin through my clothes. And the sounds, God help me, the sounds from beyond that threshold. Eliza didn't go through the doorway. Something held her back. An instinct, she wrote, that felt more like a memory passed down through her blood. Instead, she retreated to the surface and began researching the land's history. What she discovered in county records and old church documents painted a disturbing picture. The land had never been purchased by my family. It had been entrusted to us. We weren't owners, we were wardens. Part 4. According to the documents Eliza uncovered, the first European settlers in the area had encountered something they couldn't explain when they attempted to clear the land for farming. Their records spoke of a wound in the earth from which no light escapes, and voices that speak in dreams, promising knowledge beyond mortal understanding. The native tribes that had once populated the region had apparently known about the site for centuries. They called it the mouth that hungers, and kept a rotating guard to ensure nothing came out, and that no one went in. When the tribes were forcibly removed during westward expansion, a group of settlers who had witnessed what lurked beneath the earth took up the mantle of guardianship, my ancestors among them. Eliza's discoveries didn't stop there. Her journals detailed her obsessive study of the symbols in the underground chamber, which she copied meticulously into her notebooks. She consulted with linguistics professors and occult scholars under the guise of academic research, sending letters with partial copies of the symbols to universities across the country. The responses she received were disturbing in their consistency. None of the experts recognized the writing system, yet all reported the same physical reactions when studying the symbols: headaches, nausea, and dreams filled with vast, empty spaces between stars. One professor from Miskatonic University wrote back with a warning. "Destroy these symbols, Miss Blackwood. Burn your copies and forget what you've seen. Some forms of knowledge are not meant for human minds. They are keys that unlock doors better left closed." Eliza didn't heed his warning. Instead, she became convinced that the symbols were a language, one that could be deciphered and potentially used to permanently seal the doorway she had discovered. For nearly a year she worked tirelessly, filling notebook after notebook with translations and theories, and then abruptly the tone of her journals changed. October 17th, 1922. "I understand now. God help me. I understand. The symbols aren't a language, they're alive." Part 5. The next few entries were increasingly frantic, the handwriting deteriorating from Eliza's normally precise script to jagged scrawls that sometimes tore through the paper. "The symbols watch me when I sleep. They've started appearing in places I didn't put them, on fogged windows, in dust on shelves, in the condensation of my breath on cold mornings. They speak to me now. Not in words, but in concepts that unfold in my mind like poisonous flowers. They show me spaces between spaces, geometries that cannot exist in our reality. What lives beyond the doorway is ancient. It was here before the first cells divided in Earth's primordial oceans. It will be here when the last star burns out. And it is so hungry." The most disturbing entry came on November the 2nd, when Eliza described waking in the middle of the night to find herself standing at the edge of the sinkhole, with no memory of having left her bed. "And my nightgown was covered in dirt, under my fingernails too, as if I'd been digging. But that's not what terrifies me. What terrifies me is that I was holding a knife, and there was blood on my hands that I cannot account for." That same day, a local farmer reported 3 of his sheep missing. Their remains were found a week later at the bottom of a ravine, arranged in a perfect circle with their heads pointing outward. Eliza knew she was losing control, that whatever lived beyond the doorway was influencing her, using her as a conduit to affect our world. She needed to seal the entrance, but the conventional methods she tried, concrete, stone walls, even dynamite, all failed. The hole would simply reappear, sometimes larger than before. In desperation, she turned to the only option she had left, using the symbols themselves. If they are alive, they can be manipulated. If they are a key, they can also be a lock. For 3 days and nights she worked without sleep, carving modified versions of the symbols into stones that she arranged around the perimeter of the hole. Local people saw the lights from her lanterns and the strange shape she was making on the ground. That's when the witch rumors began. On the 3rd night, something happened. Eliza's account of it is fragmented, as if she could only process pieces of what she experienced. The air split open. Not just the hole, the very fabric of reality tore like tissue paper. I saw what waits on the other side. Not darkness, as I had thought, but a light so ancient it appears black to our limited perception. It has eyes, countless eyes that see everything at once, past, present, future, all laid bare. It saw me, it knows me, and it is furious at my interference. The stones are holding but barely. The symbols are fighting back, trying to rearrange themselves. I cannot let that happen. The final entry from that night described how Eliza made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the seal would hold. Blood is the only permanent ink in this world. My father understood this. That's why he took his own life. He was weakening, and he knew what would happen if the Guardian failed. I am stronger, but I cannot maintain this vigil forever. I have carved the final binding symbol into my own palm. As long as a Blackwood lives on this land, blood of my blood, the seal will hold. This is our burden now, our purpose. We are not owners of this land. We are its prison wardens. Part 6. The journals continued for decades after that night. Eliza married a local man who accepted her eccentricities, though she never told him the full truth. They had children, including my grandmother, and Eliza taught them only what they needed to know: that the garden behind the stone wall was forbidden ground, that a Blackwood must always live on the property, and that certain rituals must be performed on specific dates to maintain what she called the boundary. To the outside world, these rituals looked like witchcraft. Herbs burned at midnight, blood from a pricked finger dripped onto the earth, strange words spoken to the darkness. The reputation suited Eliza's purposes. Fear kept people away from the property, and the whispers about witchcraft concealed the much more terrible truth. I don't know how long I would have sat there if I hadn't noticed something emerging from the soil near my left hand, a tiny tendril of darkness, no thicker than a hair, pushing up through the earth like a seedling reaching for the sun. But this was no plant. It moved with purpose, twisting and curling in the air as if tasting it, and as I watched, frozen in horror, it began to shape itself into a familiar pattern, one of the symbols from Eliza's journals. I scrambled backward, heart pounding in my chest. The dark tendril continued to grow, joined by others breaking through the surface around the depression. They wove together in the air, forming more complex patterns, symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with a life of their own. I knew what was happening. The seal was weakening. Whatever lay beneath the earth was testing its boundaries, searching for a way out. And it had found one. Me. Part 9. I ran back to the house and locked myself in, though I knew doors and walls would provide no real protection if the entity broke free. I needed to think, to understand what had changed. The journals had said the seal would hold as long as a Blackwood lived on the property, and here I was, flesh and blood descendant of Eliza herself. So why was the seal failing now? The answer came to me as I paced the kitchen, my gaze falling on the calendar hanging on the wall. Today's date was circled in red, a marking made by my father before his death. And suddenly, I remembered something from my childhood, my father disappearing into the night on certain dates, returning before dawn with dirt under his fingernails and a grim set to his jaw. The renewal ritual. I had missed the renewal ritual. Eliza's journals had mentioned it, a specific ceremony that needed to be performed on equinoxes and solstices to strengthen the seal. My father had died in winter, and spring had arrived while I was lost in discovery and disbelief. The spring equinox had passed 3 days ago, and I, ignorant of my family's true purpose, had done nothing. I returned to the trunk in the attic, searching frantically through the journals for details of the ritual. I found them in a separate notebook, written in a code that took me hours to decipher. The ritual itself was relatively simple. At midnight, the guardian must walk the perimeter of the sealed area, renewing the symbols with a mixture of their own blood and certain herbs that grew on the property. But the timing was crucial. It had to be performed within 3 days of the equinox or solstice. I still had time. Barely. Part 10. Night fell with unnatural swiftness, clouds rolling in to blot out the stars. By sunset, the worst storm I'd ever seen was raging over the property. Lightning splitting the sky every few seconds, wind that bent trees until they groaned, rain falling in sheets so thick I could barely see the garden wall from the house. This was no natural storm. It knew what I was planning to do. And I gathered what I needed: A silver bowl my grandmother had always kept locked in a cabinet, dried herbs from jars in the root cellar, a knife with strange markings on the blade. As midnight approached, I changed into clothes similar to what I'd seen my father wear on those mysterious nights. All black, no synthetic materials, no metal except for the ritual knife. At 11:50 p.m., I stood before the back door, watching the seconds tick away on my father's old pocket watch. The storm had reached a fever pitch, rain hammering against the windows with such force I feared the glass might shatter. At 11:55 I stepped outside. The wind hit me like a physical blow, nearly knocking me off my feet. Rain soaked me instantly, plastering my clothes to my skin and obscuring my vision. Lightning revealed glimpses of the landscape in stark white flashes, the twisted shapes of trees, the stone wall around the garden, and beyond it, movement. Hundreds of those dark tendrils now, rising from the earth like the arms of drowning people reaching for rescue. They twisted together, forming shapes that hurt my eyes to look at, impossible geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves. I fought my way toward the garden gate, each step requiring all my strength as the wind pushed against me. The earth itself seemed to resist my passage, becoming soft and clingy beneath my feet, trying to hold me back. Something didn't want me to reach that garden. At 11:59, I reached the gate and pushed it open. Inside the wall, the storm seemed even more intense, the air thick with electricity and the scent of ozone. The tendrils had multiplied, covering almost the entire surface of the garden now, writhing and pulsing like the exposed nervous system of some vast organism. And at the center, where the slight depression had been that morning, was now a distinct hole, perhaps 2 feet across, perfectly circular, and filled with a darkness so complete it looked like a piece of the night sky had fallen to earth. Part 11. I had 1 minute to midnight, 1 minute to renew the seal. I moved to the edge of the garden and sliced my palm with the ritual knife, letting the blood drip into the silver bowl where I had already placed the herbs. The mixture hissed and steamed despite the cold rain, giving off a scent like burnt copper and something older, earthier. With my bleeding hand, I began to trace the first symbol on the ground at the western edge of the circle, just as the instructions described. The moment my blood touched the earth, the tendrils reacted, pulling back as if burned, then surging toward me in a wave of writhing darkness. I kept working, tracing symbol after symbol, moving counterclockwise around the perimeter. Each completed mark flared with a pale blue light that seemed to push back the darkness. But the entity was fighting now, the ground trembling beneath my feet, the hole at the center growing wider with each passing second. I was halfway around the circle when I heard it, a voice not from the air around me but inside my own head. It spoke without words, communicating in concepts and emotions that unfolded in my mind like blooming nightshades. It knew me, not just as an obstacle to its freedom, but intimately, as if it had been watching me my entire life, studying me, learning my weaknesses, and it made me an offer. It showed me visions of power beyond human comprehension, knowledge that no mortal mind had ever contained. It promised to share its secrets, the true nature of reality, the spaces between dimensions where entities like itself dwelled, the future of our universe and others beyond it. All I had to do was stop, walk away, let the seal break. For one terrible moment, I hesitated. What might humanity achieve with such knowledge? What might I become with such power? Then I remembered Eliza's warnings, written in increasingly desperate script as the symbols consumed her mind. It lies. What it offers is poison wrapped in promises. There is knowledge humans are not meant to have, not because we are unworthy, but because our minds cannot contain it without breaking. I continued drawing the symbols, my blood mixing with the rain and soil to form a paste that glowed faintly as I worked. The voice in my head changed from seductive to rageful, bombarding me with images of my own death, slow, painful, inevitable. The hole at the center of the garden had grown to nearly 6 feet across now, and something was rising from it. A darkness deeper than absence of light, a presence that bent reality around it like gravity-bending starlight. I completed the final symbol at exactly midnight, my fingers numb from cold and loss of blood. The moment the circuit closed, every mark I'd made flared with blinding blue-white light, forming a net of energy that surrounded the garden. The entity screamed, not with a physical voice, but with a psychic force that dropped me to my knees and sent birds erupting from trees a mile away. The darkness rising from the hole writhed against the barrier of light, testing it, searching for weaknesses. For one terrible moment, I thought the seal would fail. The blue light flickered, dimming as the darkness pushed against it. The ground cracked beneath my feet, long fissures spreading outward from the central hole like a spider web. Then I remembered one last detail from Eliza's notes, a final component of the ritual that she had added herself, not found in the ancient texts, but born from her own desperate innovation. Intent. The barrier needed more than blood and symbols. It needed purpose. I placed both hands flat on the ground, my blood seeping into the earth, and I focused every ounce of my will on a single thought: containment. I visualized the barrier strengthening, the seal holding firm, the darkness retreating back into its prison. I thought of Eliza, of my grandmother, of my father, generations of my family who had carried this burden alone, protecting a world that would never know what they had sacrificed. Now it was my turn. I don't know how long I knelt there, pouring my will into the earth. It could have been minutes or hours. The rain continued to fall, but the wind had died. The lightning ceased. There was only the darkness and the light, locked in silent combat beneath my hands. Then, slowly, the hole began to close. The tendrils retreated, slithering back into the earth like roots pulled underground. The cracks in the soil sealed themselves, leaving the garden as bare and featureless as it had been for a century. By dawn, there was no evidence of what had transpired except for the bloody symbols around the perimeter, and even those were fading as the rising sun dried the earth. The seal was renewed. The barrier held. For now. Conclusion. That was 6 months ago. I've since moved permanently into the family home, taking up the mantle that Eliza established nearly a century ago. I've studied her journals until I know them by heart, learning everything I can about the entity beneath our land and the methods she developed to contain it. I've also started my own journal, recording my experiences and discoveries for whoever might come after me. Because I understand now what Eliza knew. This is not a temporary responsibility, it's a generational one. The entity is patient. It can wait decades, centuries, millennia for a single moment of weakness. And it's not alone down there. Through dreams and the brief psychic connection we formed during that night, I've glimpsed what waits beyond the doorway Eliza discovered, an entire ecology of beings that exist in spaces our minds cannot properly comprehend, pressing against the thin membrane that separates their reality from ours. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I walk the perimeter of the garden and feel the faint vibrations beneath my feet, like something tapping gently from the other side of a wall, sending a message in code I'm glad I cannot decipher. The locals still whisper about the witch of Blackwood Ridge. Some brave teenagers still dare each other to sneak onto the property at night, only to flee when they feel the wrongness of the air around the walled garden. Let them think it's a witch's curse. Let them spin their folklore about my great-grandmother and her strange ways. Those stories are a protective shield in themselves, keeping the curious at a distance, masking a truth far more terrifying than any tale of witchcraft. Because now I understand what my great-grandmother really discovered on our land. Not magic, not witchcraft. A wound in reality, a door that should never be opened, and something ancient and hungry that waits behind it, watching with countless eyes, patient beyond human understanding. I am the last Blackwood. When I die, who will maintain the seal? Who will perform the rituals on solstices and equinoxes? Who will stand guard against what waits beneath? These questions haunt me as I add to my own growing collection of journals, hoping that somehow the knowledge will be passed on, that someone will understand the importance of what we've been guarding all these years. Because if the seal breaks, if what lies beneath our family property ever finds its way into our world, there will be no witchcraft powerful enough to save us. So if you ever find yourself driving through the forgotten corners of the Appalachian Mountains and come across a weathered house with a stone wall behind it, surrounding barren earth where nothing grows, keep driving. Some family legacies are best left undisturbed. Closing. Thank you for joining the OBSCURALORE Vault today. If this story kept you up at night, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the darkest corners of our world and beyond. Remember, some legends hide truths far more terrifying than the stories themselves. Until next time, sweet dreams.